So far in these lectures I've talked about climate change as a development problem and have explained some of the problems about vulnerability in a fairly conventional way. And the way that we've gone about understanding climate change is through these fairly standard ways of thinking about development. But anybody who's spent time in the small islands of the South Pacific would think that maybe that's not entirely the story about these places. And what I want to do today is begin to talk about some of the unique aspects of islands that can't be costed in economic models about the impacts of climate change, but which are really, really important to people and which make them quite unique places. So we might think about these things as being intangible. They don't have a price to them. They're hard to count. They're difficult to measure. But they're really important aspects of living on islands. They're what makes living on an island in the South Pacific and being a person who lives on an island in the South Pacific different to being somebody who lives in a city in a developed country. These intangible things that are important, and some of these are also at risk from climate change. Culture. Population, the viability of communities living in these islands. And indeed, perhaps their sovereignty. So I'm going to talk about these three things today briefly. They're all very large topics. To understand culture in the Pacific, it's very useful to begin to think about the land and people's relationship to the land. Typically, or a common phrase that occurs across many cultures in the Pacific is not that the land belongs to the people, but that the people belong to the land. And so there's a very different idea about the relationship between people and land, that it isn't their property, it is who they are. And this is true for the seas, that there are forms of belonging and association with the sea that transcend the kind of standard notions of property that we might understand them in the developed world. And people live, these quotidian daily practices about island life are tied up with the land, with forms of production from the land, with interacting with the land in various ways, hunting, growing food, so on, and the sea, fishing and gleaning off reefs and so on. It's part of the life, and it's part of what many people enjoy about living in the region. Community is very important. Extended families, kinship, systems of reciprocity and support. Again, people don't live as they might do in developed countries in nuclear families. They're living in extended families and networks of kinship that across villages, across islands, across countries, and across the region. And finally, religious institutions are very important to life in the Pacific. There's predominantly Christian churches, and Sundays and the role is a very important day, and the role of the church is very important in maintaining culture and tradition in the region. People take these things seriously. The land, the sea, their communities, and the church or the equivalent for respective denominations. The effect of climate change on the enjoyment that people have on the land. If people don't in the Pacific go to the bush and to their gardens to grow food, if they just go to the shop to buy their food, then a really important aspect of what it means to live in these places has changed. And people may be less likely to do that if it's a less rewarding and more difficult enterprise, because the trees aren't producing the fruit, the ground crops are not growing or growing good roots and tubers, if the times of harvesting are changing, if there's more diseases and pests and so on, then growing food and hunting and so on the land will become more difficult, more expensive and less rewarding. And this is true too about marine-based activities, and so an awful lot of livelihoods are based around gleaning crustaceans and so on from the reef, from fishing off reefs and from fishing for deep sea fish out into the oceans. It's an important form of protein. It's an important cultural practice. One of the things that defines what it means to be a member of the community and the standing, particularly of men in coastal communities in the Pacific, is often their ability as fishermen, and good fishermen tend to be people who are respected in their communities. So if you can't catch fish, if you can't go fishing, if you can't enjoy those aspects that are tied up with your identity and with your livelihood and with your community, then that too will have a significant corrosive effect on what it means to live in the Pacific Islands. And climate change may have these effects. And we do see some examples where knowledge of fisheries is proving to be less effective because fisheries are changing. And climate change may influence migration decisions, which I'll talk about soon. So what happens with crops is it's about rainfall, it's about damage from extreme events and the recovery time to regenerate crops. With fishing, it's a little bit more complicated. The deep sea fish tend to move on the breaks between the warm and the cold water, and climate change would appear to be changing, or is very likely to change, the location or the predictability of those places where the deep sea fish are. Coral bleaching and ocean acidification will impact on the structure of the population of reef fish, the distribution of certain kinds of species, and the ability to catch them. And one of the problems with fishing is that if it's harder to catch fish, it becomes more expensive to do so. You have to spend more time in the canoe or put more fuel in the boat, and then this becomes a less viable, cheap form of food. So one of the consequences of this is that ways of life that are based around living in the lands and the seas and living in communities may change. People may be less inclined or less able to meet their needs, which are not just material needs but cultural needs, through use of the land and the seas, and may seek substitutes. It may just become more effective or easier to go and buy a bag of rice than it is to grow taro, and then something will be lost. And life may be less enjoyable, and that thing which defines people who live in islands as being islanders and living an island life may be eroded, and it may simply be living in a city in the middle of an ocean. The question about migration is an interesting one, and I will come back to this in a subsequent lecture, in the next lecture, about Tuvalu a bit more. But a lot is said about climate change and forced migration from Pacific Islands, and I'll say here now only that there is an issue here. Livelihood stresses, cost of living, the ability to meet needs, health problems, difficulty accessing markets and so on may impel people to move in the future. Certainly we know that disasters can cause short-term displacements around the world, and they can do so in the Pacific Islands too. They tend to be short-term though, and people come back. It's possible that people who are anticipating future stresses arising from climate change may seek to use movement or population movement as a way of helping to deal with those problems. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it may be a very rational thing to do. But the effect is that the idea of climate change may increase population mobility. But it's important to think, and the idea that there is going to be waves of environmental refugees flooding out of islands is not a empirically very meaningful thing to say. Movement has costs. You have to traverse distances. People are not going to get in boats and paddle across the Pacific Ocean and arrive in the United States or New Zealand or Australia, because it's a very long way and the boats aren't there. It costs money. It costs money to get on an aeroplane. It costs money to buy a ticket on a boat. And when you arrive in countries, you have to have a visa. And so it simply isn't going to be the case that climate change is going to cause waves of environmental refugees from the Pacific Islands. In fact, the people who are able to negotiate those cost barriers and able to negotiate those entry barriers from islands into developed economies are not the ones we want to be worried about, because their capacity is high, they've got the money and they've got the skills to gain entry. It's the people who can't. If things are really bad and people want to leave but can't, that's where the humanitarian crisis is going to be. But all of this is conjecture, and all of this is some point in the future, and we don't know at what point in the future. It's also worth saying then that these barriers to movement mean that if there is increasing forced migration within the Pacific Islands, it's much likely to be movement within countries, from rural areas to capital cities perhaps, or from low ground to high ground, than it will be international movements across countries. But actually, it's a nice story to think little islands, big ocean, massive global change, environmental refugees, but we don't really know very much about this actually. We don't really know exactly what the effect of climate change is going to be on social and ecological systems. We don't know too much really about how it's going to play out in people's lives such that it might affect their decisions about movement. There's simply not much information about this. And we certainly don't know when this is likely to happen and when is important. Timing of all these things really matters. If it's in 60 years' time, then that's quite a long time in which we have scope to be able to think about adaptations and planning for these issues if it is to occur. We don't really know what adaptation could achieve. We're unaware at this point about what the risks to particular livelihoods and populations are and what could be done to manage them. We've really only begun to start thinking about this and really only made very tentative forays into helping to facilitate people to adapt to climate change. We don't know whether it could be effective. It could be that everybody in the region could continue to live meaningful lives for another 50 or 60 years without having to move. And migration is to a large degree a decision. People are making decisions about what it means to live here versus what it means to live there, about the risks associated with staying, the risks associated with being somewhere else, the risks and costs associated with movement. It's a complicated decision. People think about these things very carefully with their families and with their extended families. And we simply have no idea at all really about how people may make these decisions in some point in the future under conditions of climate change. So it's very premature to say climate change is going to force mass migration in the Pacific Islands. It's a risk to which we should be mindful, but it's not a done deal, it's not a fait accompli, and there's plenty we can do about that. There's also some concern then that if people are running around saying, oh, climate change is going to force environmental refugees out of the Pacific Islands and that's going to happen sometime soon, then decision makers might start making decisions like, well, if there's no future for the people living on the island, then what's the point in investing in a desalination plant for them? They're not going to need fresh water in 10 years' time. And of course, if investment decisions to provide fresh water or healthcare or education don't go because there's no perception of the future, then this will precipitate population movement in response to the perception of the risk rather than the reality of that risk unfolding. So we need to be very careful here about how we think about this issue. And finally, I guess the language, and my language that I'm talking about here is we. Well, in a real sense, this is an issue only for the people in the Pacific Islands to make decisions about. It's an issue that they have to manage and control themselves. And so people from outside the region making judgments about the future of these places, it's a very difficult and probably fairly unethical enterprise. So think carefully about this issue. It's complicated. And I'll talk more about this in the next talk. Finally, having said that, there are some long-term risks that climate change poses to the very existence of some countries under the extreme circumstances. There are 5 countries in the world that are comprised entirely of low-lying atolls where there's no high ground. Average height above sea level is 2 metres. These are Kiribati, the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Tokelau, Tuvalu. Now all of these, except the Maldives, are located in the South Pacific. These are low-lying strings of islands, typically in something like a circle, around on top of a submerged seamount. They're produced by coral material washing up and piling up above sea level. So they're quite sensitive to sea level rise, and the very production of material that makes these islands is quite sensitive to coral bleaching and ocean acidification. Under very high rates of climate change at some very distant point in the future, a metre of sea level rise, significant warming and bleaching, significant ocean acidification, then the ability of these islands to sustain populations may be seriously compromised. Again, we don't really know what adaptation can achieve. We haven't really got much of an idea about the magnitude or timing of these kinds of impacts. But the question has to be asked, and the question can't be dismissed, that under very high rates of sea level rise and extreme global warming, will these countries exist? And it's a very interesting question. If you were to say to the international population of 190 countries in the world, climate change is going to cause 5 of you to disappear in 100 or so years' time, but we're not going to tell you which 5 countries. How would they act on the problem of climate change? It's an interesting ethical experiment, isn't it? But, and you would be quite certain that this would be the biggest national security threat. If it wasn't sure which 5 countries, it could be the United States, it could be China, they would be doing everything to reduce their emissions and manage this problem. It's only that we know that it's these 5 countries that causes us to think, well, maybe what causes rich countries to think maybe we don't have to reduce our emissions, maybe we don't have to try so much. They're poor little countries in the middle of nowhere. But they're still countries, they still have a right to their sovereignty, and it's at risk because of climate change. So, beyond money and beyond the sort of things we can measure, there are things about islands that make them islands. There are things about living on islands that makes those lives unique that are also at risk from climate change. The way people live, their cultures, their values, the communities that people live in, their homes and their homelands, the places in which their cultures and societies evolve, in which their identities are formed, these things may all ultimately be at risk of climate change too.